What's up, guys? This is Melted Hand. Recently, I've been streaming a lot of CarX drift racing, and I've been having a lot of fun with you guys. I wanted to go over some things, like kind of like a tuning video, I guess you could call it. If for those of you that were on the last stream, I was having a pretty big issue with understeer with this car specifically. And basically I'm going to go through the dyno stand and kind of explain tuning, how I look at it, so that hopefully you guys, when you try to tune your cars, say you don't know how to tune, you can kind of tune it in a way that's comfortable for you, that you'll be happy with and not feel lost. So let's go into it now. So right off the bat, you got to deal with suspension. Suspension is probably one of the most key things that you're going to deal with in CarX drift racing. Now, what I can tell you just immediately looking at the car is my body of the car is basically on the ground. Now, we were drifting at Red Rock, and if you've drifted on Red Rock at any point, it's a pretty bumpy track. It's got a lot of curves, it's got a lot of dips. So a lot of this stuff plays into your car suspension. If the body of the car rubs against the road, it's going to nullify your suspension because the car is rubbing against the road. So my understeer issue, from what I can tell right now, was coming from my front spring length. Now, your spring lengths have a huge impact on how the rest of your suspension handles. If you go all the way up, say you bring this up, right? You see, I start to look like kind of like a monster truck almost. This is insane. Why would I ever run a car at 25 centimeters? Like, I'm not rally racing. So let's bring this down, obviously. That's absurd. So, if you did notice before I raised it, let me bring it back down. You can see my body of the car is basically on the ground. Now, this is where the issue comes in. That's what was occurring every time I was hitting dips and stuff. My car would understeer, which is where your front tires lose grip before your back tires. And drifting, you want to oversteer. So I would randomly straighten out. The car wouldn't respond to my inputs, things like this. And it's because of my spring length. If I raise this up, let's do 10 centimeters for safe, because Red Rock is quite a bumpy track. That immediately fixes my body issues right there. Now, obviously, you want it to look good, but at the same time, it needs to function. You need to make sure it functions. It's all well and good you slam this thing to the ground, but look, I've clipped my wheel wells. My suspension is basically non-existent at this point. And it's useless. So you need to bring it up to a comfortable height to where your suspension can move. You need to allow your suspension movement so that it can react to little inputs, and that's what we're going to get to later with the rebound and bump and stuff like that. Your stiffness is how much pressure it's going to take to compress your spring. Now, generally, I don't mess with this too much. It can affect your ride height. As you can see, if I drop the stiffness all the way down, it doesn't take much pressure. Remember, there's an engine in this car. There is weight in this car. So you have to compensate for how much weight is going to be shifting around while you're drifting. You don't want to compensate too much. Keep it at pretty much middle, until you kind of figure out what works best. If you want to loosen your stiffness up to maybe make it react faster, you can do that. Ultimately, kind of just keep it towards the center as long as you're happy with it. So now let's go over fast bump and regular bump and rebound. This, in most situations, you'll call this fast bump and slow bump. So this is your slow bump. Will be generally driving the car around whenever you run over like a curb, something like that has a very slow reaction, a slow impact to the suspension itself. For this, you generally want to run, I would say for this one, I'm going to keep it around 5,000 because everything was working fine with the car prior. I was just having a understeer issue. But this generally tightens your suspension up. As you can see in the top left, it is transferring weight in turns during braking or accelerating. The higher value, more stable, but values too high can slow down function of suspension. What that means is if I've got this turned all the way up and you hit a bump, it's just going to keep it stiff. It's not going to allow it to compress. Consider your bump compression, allowing the spring to come inward to react to the bump. If you hit a bump and it's just and the spring stays out, then your car is going to flop. Like it's going to be like running over something stiff. That is basically what it is. It's stiff. So you want it to have give. You want it to give, but you don't want it to give so much that you lose stability of the car itself. Now this isn't something so much that you have to worry about with drifting. You kind of worry about it in games like Forza Horizon and Forza itself, Gran Turismo, Project Car, any racing game, you're going to worry about it. Also, rally racing is big about your bump stiffness and your rebound because that's a lot of suspension travel going on. Drifting, you can get away with not even really messing with this if you don't want to. If you don't feel comfortable messing with it, then don't. You're not going to hurt yourself by doing anything with it. I'm just going to adjust these numbers here real quick. All right. So let's go into front toe, front and rear toe. What this does is essentially takes, if you're looking at your tire straight down, you'll have both tires straight forward. Now, if you bring your toe outward, you're going to point the front of the tires out versus the rear of the tires. So you're going to kind of create, instead of a rectangle, you're going to create like a trapezoid effect. And I do apologize, I just went toe in there. So you want to go toe out, which is negative. And as you can see, if you saw that there, the front tire kind of pulled itself out a little bit. You see? Now this is helpful when you're trying to initiate drifts or keep a drift going and stuff like that, because the more toe you have, the further out the wheel is reaching. And it can very much affect your handling. If you have too much toe out, then you're going to get a very squirrely feel in the front. You're not going to be very stable. It's going to be hard to control because your tires are constantly pulling in an outward direction. It wants to go somewhere else other than straight. So if you want, you can kind of give a little bit of toe. Say, well, if I can get this thing to do it correctly. I'm trying to get 0.1. You know what? It's 0.11. That's where we're at. Also with your rear toe can affect how much you push out when you initiate your drift. So if you hold your handbrake and you start sliding out, having that toe out, when you hit the gas, it's going to kind of fling your car outward a lot faster than if you just have like neutral toe at 0, or if you have almost inward toe. Inward toe kind of wants to keep the car as straight as possible. So we'll give that a little bit out because I was having kind of a bit of an issue with keeping it outward. So camber, this depends a lot on the power of your car. Later on, it doesn't really affect it as much. When you start pushing 6, 7, 800, you're not, the camber is more for stability in the drift itself. So you see I'm running -6.5 camber in the front. This feels very comfortable for me. It's very stable. It's very easy to maintain. And also, I think with the rear camber, I'm probably going to bring it in just a little bit, because once I reached a certain angle, say I reached like 60 degrees or more of angle, unintentionally, or I was trying to slow down against a tandem or something like that, I would basically lose control. I'd go sideways. So I think I'm going to tuck this one in just a bit, maybe 2.5, as close to 2.5 as we can get. There we go. And we'll just leave that there. Now your roll bars. Your roll bars can have a huge impact in your sharpness of turning, in how your car reacts to drifting. It ties both wheels together, because your wheels are completely independent in cars. So the roll bar is what ties your car together to keep it level. So if you have your front roll bar super duper stiff, when you try to initiate a drift, the whole front of your car is going to want to stay straight as possible. So it creates a kind of whiplash effect in the rear, where it forces your rear out super fast. But at the same time, having too much roll bar will not allow your front tires to effectively grip the road. So you could actually unintentionally cause a understeer scenario by tuning your roll bars up too high. Again, this is all user preference and how the car feels. Generally, your front roll bar, the stiffer it goes, the more the rear will oversteer. The more you stiffen the rear roll bar, the more the front will understeer. You need a certain amount of anti-roll in order to create a stable car, but it doesn't have to be, you know, all the way up here at 130, 150. That's, you know, you're not in a race car. You can have it down here. I mean, your car can be floppy, and that's totally okay if you want a floppy car. Caster and Ackermann, we're going to get to in just a second. The max steering angle, this is really up to you. You know, you can bang this thing out all the way at 60 degrees. What I will tell you is that it gives you a larger drift angle, yes, but it can make your car understeer if you have too much, because you're expecting too much out of the car. Generally, I think it's standard at 55, maybe even 57. These are perfectly fine numbers. As you saw before, mine was at 58. I had no issues with this whatsoever. Ackermann angle, this affects your tires tied together. So when you turn the front of your car, say all the way to the left like now, most normal cars will have an Ackermann of, I want to say 35%. So your tires will not be turned exactly the same way. So your inner tire that you're turning will turn a lot sharper than your outer tire. And this is meant for safety and everything like that. However, for drifting, you kind of want the tires to be on the same angle, or else it creates kind of a twitchiness in the front of the car when you're trying to maintain your drift. So if you have a 35 Ackermann, I mean, your inside tire is going to be pulling super hard, but your outer tire is going to be wanting to straighten up. So you kind of want to tie those together. You can keep it at like 60. It'll give you a nice little blend between twitchiness and stability. Essentially, the higher your angle goes, the more stable it is, all the way to 100%. You'll be perfectly tied together. But anything, you know, below 80 to, I would say, maybe 50% is a very comfortable range once you get used to it. Now, because you've adjusted your Ackermann angle, your caster comes into effect. Your caster, if you watch the front of my tires, is the angle of your tires camber while it's under full turn radius. Now, most casters and vehicles, normal vehicles, you'll probably find a 10, maybe even a 9. But you'll see the outer tire is negative camber, but your inner tire is positive camber, actually. This is not good when you're trying to have grip for the front of your car. So the ultimate goal is to have your inner tire as close to zero camber as possible. That's generally what you want. But to some degree, because I mean, you can slam this thing all the way down to 0. Now, your outer tire is almost at 0, but you see your inner tire still has negative camber, and you really want your inner tire to be as close to 0. So you kind of just eyeball it, give it a look, maybe be a little comfortable with positive camber just a little bit, because you want your outside tire to have negative, and you want to be pretty close to 0 here. So let's leave it at like 7. That's almost exact, you know? That'll be perfect. And that's the entire suspension. That's pretty much how you'll handle that. Now, if I was to take this out just as is, it would probably drift a lot better. But let's talk about the wheels. Depending on the type of car you have, you see, and also as well, remember your wheels will affect your suspension. Currently, I'm pushing, let's see, I have 830 horsepower. All right. I'm not fully maxed out. I could max this out more. I don't want to. It feels fine just the way it is. But you generally, I think these come with 17s, maybe even 16 stock. You can plus those up just a little bit to give yourself more clearance for your body. Your tire width, this can affect your grip more than anything. With the amount of horsepower you're pushing, you generally don't want to be under 300 millimeters for your rear tire. I know it's unrealistic, really, in some aspects, but it does really help out in the game. Tire pressure, I haven't had so much issues with standard tire pressure, 200 kPa. I have seen people running, 90. That seems to be working really good with people. Maybe even 110 here. And we can try that out. We'll see. Maybe we'll see at the end of the video if I end up doing that. But for now, I'm going to leave it stock. Well, what I had it at. Your wheel adhesion is essentially the grip that your tires have on the road. When you're tandeming with a lot of guys on stream and stuff like that, we like to do between 90 to 100. So you'll see that my tire kind of balds a little bit, and you see that it's changing. I'm essentially putting a different tire on. So consider this like your boring street tire that you probably picked up from a friend. They're good for like a couple runs, but then they're going to blow up on you. Your 100 is like your standard. You just picked up some fresh tires from the auto store, and you want to go burn rubber because that's what you do. 110, you're kind of getting into the semi-slick range. For car guys, you're probably looking at like Toyo R888s. You could take these to a track. And then 120, I mean, you're basically on slicks. You have a very tiny little strip there that I can see. But ultimately, this thing is so grippy. You're probably going to be so snappy in your drifts that you're not going to want to do it. So a lot of dudes in tandem will do 90 to 100, and some will even mix, like they'll do 90 in the rear and then 100 in the front to give the grip in the front but the looseness in the rear. So let's go on to wheel tracks. All right. Wheel tracks are very simple. The wider your track is, say you extend this thing all the way out, which is completely unrealistic, your front end is going to be so unbelievably stable. It might actually even be understeer with how much grip you'll have. Because the wider your tires are, the wider your car is, essentially. So it adds much more stability. Now, I don't have mine kicked out a lot because I don't feel that it needs it. The 240 is a fairly wide car as it is. If you want the aesthetics, you can pump it out to like 4 and you should still be fine. What you do need to worry about when you start pushing out like this is clipping with the wheel well. That's one thing you have to worry about. So I keep mine at like a 2, a 1. I mean, it's a very stable car as it is. Now your rear base, you see the rear's already pretty much on the edge, so I might actually tuck this in. Maybe about there. Yeah, that seems about right. Because at the end of the day, you need to worry about what your suspension is going to do. Now, if I hit a pothole or something happens and I brake really hard, I need my tires to clear more than anything, or else bad things will happen. And then your tire profile is essentially how high your tire is. So if I start bringing this down, you see it changes everything, because now I have, it's a percentage, but it's actually in millimeters. That's actually 30 millimeters. So this is 25 and 20. You're basically on a rubber band. So it adds a little bit of, clearance for the body, but it also helps with handling. Remember, your tires flex. They are rubber filled with air. So if you start pumping this thing up like a drag tire, like, you got a 50, then you need to compensate all of your suspension for that. But also, this 50 is going to flex a lot more in a drift than this 35 will. Generally run like a 35 or a 40, depending on how nostalgic you want to be. You can run 30s if you're feeling really cool, but 35s work just fine. So now we're on to the engine. And a lot of people have different ways of doing this. A lot of people have certain restrictions. It's up to what you feel you can handle. Now, the one thing I will mention out of this whole thing, you can max this engine, you can max the rev limiter, you can put a turbocharger on, you can max this whole thing out, you can have 900 horsepower, doesn't matter. What you need to worry about is your max torque. That's all I'm going to talk about here. So when you push your max torque all the way up, you see how everything on the graph changes? You want to have your max torque where you're going to brake for your drift, essentially. You don't want it at, close to 5,000 RPMs. I mean, maybe you do. It's up to you. But you kind of want to have your torque lower down, because it's not going to affect so much anything higher up. So most of the time when you're drifting, you're getting up to speed and everything else. You want your torque to be at its max around 4,000 RPM for this car, because that's where your most tire breakage is going to be at. If you hit the handbrake and you slam that gas, you want your peak torque to be right at around 4,000, because that's probably where your tire speed is at, your gears are at that time. And then from there, it's just a matter of maxing out your rev limiter, which is why your rev limiter should be all the way up. Look at this. If I put my rev limiter all the way down, look at all the extra power that I'm missing out on. I mean, that's like 100, 200 horsepower right there. Also, your top speed is affected. I think, your 0 to 100 kilometers is affected. I mean, everything gets messed up. But that's pretty much it for engine. Your transmission type, you'll have two different types here. You've got a standard, which is, U shift 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a H-shaped pattern, or sequential, the rally cars, where you smash it forward or smash it back. Sequentials will be faster, and it affects the sound in the game. It says so. Actually, I just noticed it doesn't say that it affects anything. It just affects the sound. So if you like the sequential sound, use a sequential. If you want a standard, use a standard. It's your preference. Your diff lock is your rotational speed of the rear wheels. So both of your rear wheels are tied together with a differential. This locking ratio says, okay, if the input is 1 for let's say the right wheel, then the left wheel is going to get 0.85 of that. It's going to get 85% of 1. So your right tire is spinning at 100%, but your left is spinning at 85. Now this is good for stability for some reason. However, what I will say is that if you want to max out to 100%, you're guaranteed to drift. Like, you could have the worst setup known to man. You could be flat on the ground with no tire pressure, and you lock your diff to 100%, it's gonna drift. You know, that's what most drifters starting out do. They literally weld their differentials together so that it locks both rear tires together. So experiment with this. You generally want between, I would go as low as 70 all the way up to 100. I found 85 is a nice balance between driving in general. Like sometimes I'm trying to catch up to people in a drift or in a tandem. So I don't want to be spinning all over the place trying to catch up in a turn. I want to be able to just drive the car. So I try to leave a little bit of unlock available. Your final drive and your gearing, this affects your speed, your acceleration, all these other things. I can't really go too far in detail because it doesn't have a graph that I can show you what these numbers mean. So I'm just going to kind of leave these numbers here for you if you want to copy them. What I will tell you about this build is gear 3 is the main gear that I sit in. If I need more power or if I need to push extra long on a drift to get to the next turn, then I'll pop into gear 4. But most of the time I'm sitting in gear 3, almost or pretty much maxing out the revs. And if, like I said, if I need to, I'll just pop into gear 4. If it's a tight track, I'll pop into gear 2 for a minute, but go right back into gear 3. Now for your brakes. There's not too much to talk about brakes. You want your torque. Your torque just essentially means how hard your brakes are going to hit when you press them. If you put this up too high, you're going to lock your brakes up every single time you touch the pedal. If you put it too low, you're not even going to slow down fast enough to even notice that your brakes are working. So you kind of have to find the nice medium point for your torque. What I will say for your front brake bias, this is where things get tricky. I tend to run a 90% front bias because I play games like Forza and stuff like that on the side, where I kind of use the brakes, the brake pedal as my front brakes. I almost treat it like a motorcycle, where my brake pedal is for the front brakes and my handbrake is for the back brakes when I'm tandem drifting. So for this, essentially you're putting the front brake bias means how much of the bias of the brake power is going towards the front versus the rear. So when I hit the brake, 90% of this torque is going to the front of the vehicle versus the rear. So when I'm in a drift, if I tap my brakes, my front end is going to slow down versus my rear, which is still sliding, which allows me to slow down a little bit, but also allows me to maybe get a little bit more angle on somebody. Maybe I can sneak into their door a little bit better. And it generally helps out. ABS I don't run. This is a personal preference because I try not to lock my tires up with my pedal pressure. You can fully run ABS. It's completely up to you. It essentially just stops your tires from locking up and you just sliding away. And launch control for tandems, you know, that's again your choice. I think it helps you. Obviously it's launch control. So I say for now I've buried this down pretty well. And let's go give it a test drive. Let's see if the issues are still there. No. You went a little bit out on me there. But that was kind of my own fault because I wasn't correcting it. I must say it feels a lot smoother now. I can see the front is actually able to react to what's going on the road. All right. There you go, guys. I hope this helped out. I hope it helps you be able to tune your car a little bit better. And we'll see you in the next video or the next stream.